Something is happening at Mount Sinai that officials in the region are struggling to explain. In the pre-dawn hours, multiple independent witnesses stationed at different elevations along the mountain recorded the same phenomenon. A deep amber glow visible from the summit and upper slopes, not the scattered orange of a brush fire moving with wind, but a contained stationary illumination emanating from within the rock itself, pulsing slowly, brightening and dimming in a rhythm that one geologist on site described as disturbingly regular. At the same time, temperature sensors placed along the mountain's northern face registered heat anomalies that do not correspond to any surface fire, any volcanic activity, or any solar reflection pattern recorded in the region's entire monitoring history. And then, in the hours that followed, the silence broke. A sound rose from the mountain, not wind, not rockfall, not the distant percussion of thunder. Witnesses at the base described it as something between a voice and a tone, structured, resonant, and impossible to locate at a single source, as though the mountain itself was producing it from every surface at once. And this was not all. Along the lower slopes, in a narrow canyon that local Bedouin guides have long refused to enter after dark, a group of researchers documented something else entirely. The sand on the canyon floor had fused in places, not from heat applied to the surface, but from below, as though an intense thermal event had passed through the ground from underneath and vitrified the mineral layer into a smooth glass-like surface. No lightning strike, no known geological process. The canyon floor, in sections, had been transformed into something that should not exist without a temperature no natural surface event in that environment could produce. These things, the light within the rock, the unexplained heat, the sound without a source, and now glass beneath the sand, are not being reported from a place chosen at random. They are being reported from the mountain where, according to scripture, God first descended in fire, where Moses removed his sandals because the ground was holy, where the law was given and the covenant was sealed between heaven and a people who had just come out of slavery. If this message speaks to you, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Write the words, "I hear it," and let others who are searching know they are not standing alone. Mount Sinai does not occupy the same category as other mountains. It is not significant because of its height, which is modest by any measure, or because of its geography, which is remote and austere. It is significant because of what happened there, and because of who was present when it happened. In the book of Exodus, the account of the theophany at Sinai is described with a density of sensory detail that is unusual even within a text known for precision. The mountain smoked, the ground trembled, there was fire. There was a sound like a trumpet that grew louder and louder until the people at the base begged Moses to go up alone because they could not bear what they were hearing. God did not appear at Sinai in a still small voice the way he later would to Elijah at that same mountain. He appeared in a way that the people watching from below were overwhelmed by. They drew back. They trembled. They asked that the experience stop before it destroyed them. What they witnessed was not a vision or a private revelation. It was a public event, attended by an entire community, recorded in detail, and referenced again and again throughout the rest of Scripture as the foundational moment of a covenant between God and Israel. What is easy to miss when reading that account at a distance of 3,000 years is how physically overwhelming the original Sinai event was for the people who stood at the base of the mountain. Scripture records that the people trembled and stood far off. It records that even Moses said, "I am exceedingly afraid and trembling," according to the epistle to the Hebrews. The mountain was put in quarantine. Boundaries were drawn. Animals that wandered past those boundaries were to be stoned rather than retrieved, so that no unauthorized contact could occur between the ordinary world and the space the presence occupied. Whatever descended on Sinai was not a gentle spiritual impression. It was something with physical weight, physical heat, physical sound, and a physical effect on the people and animals in the surrounding area. The ground itself was changed by the contact, and the text preserves that detail carefully, as if to make clear that what happened at Sinai was not a metaphor for inner transformation. It was an event with coordinates, with witnesses, and with measurable consequences on the material world. The first time God spoke from fire at Sinai, he spoke to a man who had been keeping sheep for 40 years in obscurity. A man who had fled Egypt under the weight of a killing and spent decades far from everything he had once been. Moses, at the burning bush, was not expecting fire. He had not positioned himself to receive a message. He turned aside because he saw something burning that was not consumed, and his turning aside is what changed everything. That detail has never lost its weight. It was not the fire alone that mattered. It was the willingness to stop and look. Because countless others may have passed that hillside on other days without seeing anything remarkable, or seeing it and walking on without investigating. Moses stopped. He turned. And the conversation that followed that single act of attention reshaped the history of the world. Now fire is being reported at the same mountain, light within rock that does not consume, heat without flame, sound without visible source, and glass beneath the sand where no glass should be. The question that the text already asks is being asked again by what is being observed. Will you turn aside? The heat anomalies recorded along the northern face of the mountain have been reviewed by two independent thermal imaging teams. Both have issued the same assessment. The readings do not correspond to surface phenomena. The heat signature originates from within the rock at a depth that would require a magma intrusion to explain geologically, and there is no magma intrusion beneath Sinai. The Sinai Peninsula does not sit above any active volcanic system. The tectonic setting of the region is known well enough that a subsurface heat source of this kind would require a geological event of significant scale to produce, and no such event has been detected by seismic monitoring stations in Egypt, Israel, or Saudi Arabia. The heat is there. The explanation for where it's coming from is not. Thermal imaging has also confirmed that the heat is not uniformly distributed across the anomalous zone. It appears in clusters, and those clusters correspond almost exactly to the areas where witnesses reported seeing the amber glow emanating from the rock surface, which means the light and the heat are coming from the same locations within the mountain, which means they are connected, which means this is a single phenomenon with two observable expressions, not two separate events arriving by coincidence. Scientists reviewing the data have used careful language: unexplained subsurface thermal activity, anomalous heat distribution, inconsistent with known geological profiles, no confirmed source. That careful language is the language of people who recognise that what they are looking at does not fit the models they have, and who are not yet prepared to offer an alternative. And that gap between observation and explanation is exactly the space that the original Sinai account occupied in the minds of the people who stood there. They could see it, they could feel it, they could hear it, but they had no framework for what it was. The fire that burned without consuming was not a failure of their understanding. It was the point. It was the signal that something was present that did not operate by the rules they knew. From the perspective of the text, that unfamiliarity is not new. Exodus chapter 3 verse 2 says the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in a flame of fire from within a bush, and though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. The detail that the bush was not consumed is not incidental. It is the point. Fire that obeys ordinary physics would consume whatever it touches. Fire that does not consume is fire operating under a different principle entirely. It is fire that communicates rather than destroys, and the heat now being detected within the rock at Sinai is heat without flame, heat without the burning that heat is supposed to produce. Something is producing heat and light without the destruction that heat and light are expected to cause. And that parallel between the burning bush that was not consumed and the burning mountain that is not burning is not something that can be dismissed simply by noting that both involve heat and rock. Then there is the matter of the fused sand. The canyon floor on the lower western slope has been studied now by 3 separate materials scientists brought in independently. All 3 agree on the physical facts. The sand in affected sections has been vitrified. It has been converted into a glass-like material by exposure to extreme temperatures applied from below the surface. The temperature required to produce this conversion in silicate sand is approximately 1,700 degrees Celsius. For reference, the surface temperature of a bolt of lightning, where it strikes the ground, can reach approximately 30,000 degrees Celsius and does produce fused sand, which is called fulgurite. But fulgurite forms in narrow, branching, irregular shapes that follow the path of the electrical discharge. What is present in this canyon does not look like fulgurite. The fused sections are broad, relatively flat, and follow the contour of the canyon floor rather than branching irregularly. They also appear in sections that show no evidence of a strike point, no crater, no central impact, no radiating damage pattern. The fusing did not come from above and strike downward. It came from below and moved upward through the sand. One of the materials scientists, when asked what natural process could account for this pattern, said simply that she was not aware of one. Not that one does not exist, that she was not aware of one. That is a significant distinction. It is the language of a scientist being careful not to claim more than the evidence supports, but it is also the language of a scientist who looked at the data and could not match it to anything in the catalogue of known phenomena. In Exodus 19, verse 18, it says that Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire, and the smoke went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. The smoke of a kiln. That comparison is chosen deliberately. A kiln is not a wildfire. It is not a random combustion. A kiln is a controlled, sustained, intense heat source used to transform raw material into something harder, something permanent, something changed at the molecular level. The ancient text reaches for that image specifically because what happened at the base of the mountain affected the physical environment in the way that a kiln affects clay. Something was transformed, something was hardened, something was permanently altered by the contact between the presence and the material world, and now the sand at the base of that same mountain has been transformed. Hardened, permanently altered, not from above, from below. Then there is the sound. The accounts given by witnesses at the base of the mountain are consistent enough across separate observers that the research team on site has committed them to a formal record. The sound was heard across a period of approximately 40 minutes in the early morning hours. It was not constant. It rose and fell in intervals that several listeners independently described as deliberate, as though the sound was structured rather than random. A sound engineer who happened to be part of a documentary team working in the region was present during part of the event and captured audio on professional equipment. When the recording was analysed, it showed a fundamental frequency of approximately 111 Hz, with harmonic overtones stacked above it at regular intervals. That particular bass frequency has appeared in acoustic analyses of other unexplained sound events near ancient sacred sites in the past decade, a detail that has drawn attention in both scientific and theological communities without producing a consensus explanation. What the sound engineer said off the record was this: the recording does not behave like a natural acoustic event, it has structure. In nature, resonance inside rock produces irregular overtones with unpredictable spacing. What was captured at Sinai has spacing that is mathematically consistent across the full duration of the recording, as though whatever is producing it is not reacting to external conditions, but generating its own organised signal from within the mountain. Beyond the structure of the sound itself, there was its effect on those who heard it. This detail is harder to quantify, but appears in enough independent accounts that it cannot be ignored. People who were present during the sound event described not just hearing it, but feeling it enter the body. Several described a pressure in the chest. Others described a sensation of stillness that arrived suddenly, not the stillness of someone choosing to be calm, but the stillness of someone whose movement has been arrested by something external. Two members of the research team who are not religiously observant and who had no prior framework for interpreting the experience used nearly identical language when describing what happened to them while the sound was present. They said it felt like being addressed, not like hearing a message, like being the recipient of direct attention from something that knew they were there. That quality, the quality of being specifically known and specifically addressed is precisely what the biblical account of Sinai describes as the experience of the people at the base. The sound did not address them in the aggregate, it addressed them as individuals, and the terror they felt was not the terror of a natural disaster, which is impersonal, it was the terror of encounter, which is profoundly personal. The sound at Sinai now is structured, sustained, and felt in the body, and it is producing in those who hear it the same category of response that the text records in the people who stood at this mountain 3,000 years ago. In Exodus 19, verses 16 through 19, the trumpet sound at Sinai grew louder as Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. The communication between heaven and the mountain was not one-directional. It was a dialogue. Something spoke, something answered. And the sound that surrounded that exchange was not background noise. It was part of the message, the audible texture of a presence making itself known to a community that had not yet learned how to receive what was about to be given to them. The sound at Sinai now is not identical to that account. It has not produced a visible figure or a set of instructions carved in stone. But it is a structured sound with no natural source, rising from a mountain where sound was once the medium through which one of the most consequential conversations in human history was conducted. And the people at the base are responding the way people at the base of that mountain have always responded. They are standing still. They are silent. They are asking what they are hearing and whether they should draw closer or step back. What is emerging most clearly now, when all of these events are placed side by side, is not a single dramatic announcement, but a pattern of accumulation. The light appeared first, then the heat readings followed, then the sound was heard, then the fused sand was found. Each successive discovery has not replaced the previous one. It has added to it, the way layers of sediment add to each other, building toward a surface that eventually becomes visible to anyone paying attention. This is the structure of prophetic warning throughout Scripture. It rarely arrives as a single overwhelming event, with no prior preparation. It arrives in stages, each stage interpretable on its own terms, each stage also pointing beyond itself to something larger that is forming just at the edge of perception. In the book of Amos, chapter 3, verse 7, it is written that God does nothing without first revealing his plan to his servants, the prophets. This verse does not mean that every natural anomaly is a prophetic declaration, but it does establish a principle deeply embedded in the tradition, that before decisive action there is prior disclosure, that the pattern of God moving in the world includes a period of signal before the movement becomes undeniable, which means that if something is approaching, the time before its arrival is precisely when signs of its coming would be expected to appear. The accumulation at Sinai, light, heat, sound, and transformed earth fits the texture of that prior disclosure. Not proof, not certainty, but accumulation moving in a direction. The convergence of these events at this particular mountain during a period when other signs are being reported across the wider region raises a question that can be asked without claiming certainty about its answer. Is this a moment of isolated geological anomaly? Or is the mountain where God first made himself known to a people in fire and sound and holiness doing something it has done before, drawing attention to itself at a time when attention is being sought? Because Mount Sinai is not simply where the law was given, it is where the relationship began. The covenant at Sinai was not a legal document handed down by an indifferent authority, it was a proposal, a formal declaration of belonging, God to people, people to God. And the fire, and the sound, and the trembling were not decorations surrounding the legal exchange. They were the atmosphere of encounter. They were what it felt like for the infinite to press itself into the finite world close enough to be heard and seen and physically felt by people standing on a desert mountain in sandals. The book of Hebrews, chapter 12, verses 18 through 29, returns to the Sinai event and draws a comparison between what happened there and what is still coming. The writer describes Mount Sinai as a mountain that could be touched, that burned with fire, that was wrapped in darkness and gloom and tempest, and the sound of a trumpet, and the voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them. And then the writer says that those who belong to the new covenant, have come not to that mountain, but to something greater, to a heavenly assembly, to the city of the living God, to innumerable angels, to the assembly of the firstborn. And then, after all of that elevation, the writer issues a warning. See that you do not refuse him who is speaking, for if they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, much less will we escape if we reject him who warns from heaven. And then, a few verses later, comes the line that echoes everything being observed at Sinai right now. For our God is a consuming fire. That phrase is not new in Hebrews. It is a quotation from Deuteronomy, from Moses himself, speaking about what he witnessed on the mountain. The consuming fire is not a future threat. It is a present characteristic. It is what God is, not what God will become under certain conditions, but what God is at all times, in all places, whether or not the fire is visible to human perception. And when the rock of Sinai begins to glow from within, and the sand at its base fuses into glass, and a structured sound fills the pre-dawn air, what is becoming visible may simply be what has always been true, finally pressing through the surface of the material world into human sensory range. When fire appears again in that rock, it does not prove the encounter is repeating, but it asks whether we have forgotten what the first encounter meant, whether the covenant that was sealed in fire on that mountain has been remembered, kept and built upon, or whether centuries of comfort and distraction have quietly dissolved what was once so overwhelming, that a nation drew back from a mountain and begged not to hear any more. The people of Israel at the base of Sinai were not wicked people having a bad day. They were a community that had just witnessed the plagues of Egypt, had crossed the Red Sea on dry ground, and had been sustained in the desert for months by water from rock and food from the sky. They had already seen extraordinary things, and still, when the presence descended on the mountain in fire and sound, they could not bear it. They asked Moses to stand between them, and whatever this was, they needed an intermediary. They needed someone to go up and hear and come back and translate. And Moses went up, and what he received there, in the fire and the cloud, was not given to him alone. It was given for the people. It was the shape of a life that would be different, marked, directed by something other than appetite and power and fear. The law given at Sinai was not a burden imposed on an unwilling people. It was a gift offered to a people who had just been freed and who needed to know what freedom was actually for. So when the mountain burns again, the question it raises is not only whether the presence is near, the question it raises is whether the people below are living the way people live who know that the presence is near, whether the freedom most people in the modern world enjoy is being used the way freedom given by God was always intended to be used. In a world that has more information than any generation before it, and more distraction than any generation could have previously imagined, the fire at Sinai asks a question that information and distraction cannot answer. Not what do you know, not what have you seen, but what have you done with it. In the first epistle of John, chapter 4, verse 18, it is written that perfect love casts out fear. That verse is often quoted in the context of personal comfort, but its original landscape is the Sinai tradition, the understanding that the God who descended in fire on a desert mountain did not do so to frighten, but to draw near. The fire was not a threat, it was a form of presence. The sound was not punishment, it was the sound of arrival, and the trembling of the people was not only terror. It was the response of the finite to the infinite, the recognition that something vastly greater than anything they had encountered before had chosen to come close. The correct response to that closeness was never to run. It was to receive. It was to allow the encounter to do what the encounter was designed to do, which was to change the person standing in its presence into someone oriented towards something beyond themselves, someone who had been addressed and knew it and could not pretend otherwise. So as the mountain produces light from within its stone and heat from beneath its sand and sound from every surface at once, the invitation extended is not to panic and not to calculate. It is to do what Moses did when he saw the bush burning and understood that something unusual was happening. To turn aside, to stop moving, to take off the ordinary protection of certainty and explanation and stand for a moment on ground that has always been holy, asking the question that the mountain has always been waiting to hear answered. Here I am. And if the light within the rock is a question directed at the living world, the answer it is waiting for is not a doctrinal position or a theological argument. It is a person who stops, looks, and does not look away. The mountain burned once, and a covenant was born. The mountain is burning again. And whether the glass beneath the sand was made by heat from below, or by something that has no name in the geological record, it is permanent now. It will remain there long after the researchers have filed their reports and returned to their offices and attempted to find language for what they measured and could not explain. The ground at the base of Sinai has been changed. Something passed through it. And the only question that matters now is the same one it has always asked of everyone who notices the fire. Will you come closer, or will you stand at a distance and wait for it to stop? Because the fire at the burning bush did not stop while Moses watched. It continued burning precisely because the point was not the fire itself. The point was the conversation that the fire made possible. And if the mountain is burning again, it is not burning to destroy. It is burning to begin something. It is burning because the God who is a consuming fire has not finished speaking. And the ones who will hear what is being said are not the ones who explain it away and move on. They are the ones who turn aside, take off their shoes, and stand still long enough to listen.